All time yielded back, all time has been yielded back. Then the question is whether Donald John Trump is subject to the jurisdiction of a court of impeachment for acts committed while President of the United States, notwithstanding the expiration of his term in that office.
I ask for the yeas. Nays, Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. No. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. No. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. No. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. No. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters. Aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed. Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney. Aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sasse? Mr. Sasse, aye. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? No. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? No. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville? No. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Moran, no. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn, no. The yeas are 56 and the nays are 44, and then Elizabeth will have something for the read.
On this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 44, and pursuant to S. 47, the Senate having voted in the affirmative on the foregoing question, the Senate shall proceed with the trial as provided under the provisions of that resolution.